Okay, kids, having considered the beginnings of the Cold War in the rest of the world, let's look at how the Cold War affected people here at home in America. Um, First of all, before I get into the specifics of that, let me just point out a couple of things that you should bear in mind. One is television. Um, AP doesn't seem to spend a lot of time on it, but it's something worth considering. Television as a technology goes back really even to the 1920s. There was I won't get into all the science and physics of it. If somebody's interested, I welcome them to email me or come and talk to me. I'd love to explain how early television worked on an electronic and mechanical level. But the important thing to know is television had been invented way back the 20s and 30s, had been worked on, but it wasn't really practical. Before World War II, there had actually been a couple of broadcast television stations, but in the New York area, no kidding, there were literally something like 100, that's it, 100 television sets in the whole metropolitan region. And almost all of them were in the homes of executives working for the major radio companies that were trying to get into television. And the television stations themselves were experimental. So really they started these experimental TV stations broadcasting from Manhattan, and then they would give televisions to the executives in the company who lived out in New Jersey and Westchester to report in on what sort of reception they were getting, how clear was the picture, this sort of thing. So there wasn't really broadcast television as we know it until after the war, in part because there was, well, largely because the war effort was focused on making equipment, electronic equipment, stuff for the troops. People weren't really the sort of metal and special substances, phosphorus and stuff that was used to make televisions. You didn't want siphoned off for commercial, consumer use when you needed it for the military. After the war, though, television begins to come into its own. At first, it was in places like bars and things, and then people began getting them in their homes. And so by the mid to late, or really by the late 40s and into the 50s, people really began to eat this up. The explosion of television sales was phenomenal. Very hard for you guys to understand since you're used to having so much electronics around you all the time. The concept that, there was a time when nobody had any electronic gadgetry, and all of a sudden, every house had to have a TV set. Now, why do we bring this up? It affected a lot of things. Obviously, it affected entertainment. It affected education. People then were already talking about it rotting kids' brains, which there's some argument for. Lowering the culture, blah, blah, blah. But it also affected people's access to political information and information about happening events. So during the 50s, for instance, there are a bunch of hearings. When we talk about the Mccarthy hearings, which we'll get to, he held these hearings that you read about on TV. People tuned in every day and could watch this happening live, on their television sets. This is the first time. People before this, had vague notions of what went on in Congress, or they saw bits and pieces of it in movies. But to actually watch a congressional committee doing something live, this had a great impact on people. Radio was also available to people, and it started to make stars of these folks. Anyway, I just mentioned that. Also, you have rising prosperity. All these guys come home from the war. There's a little bump after the war as everybody tries to find jobs, and the GIs try to readjust. People kind of wanted to gloss over that. There is one of the great American movies. I'd love to do a course on American cinema, but there are a handful of movies that are defining movies in American cinema. And one of them is called The Best Years of Our Lives, which is a semi-fictional account of three guys coming home from the military right at the end of the war and trying to get back into civilian society. The thing that makes it interesting is that it wasn't a propaganda piece. It wasn't, hey, here's the great heroes, everybody welcomes them back with a slap on the back and a big party, and then they're off to the factory making a lot of money and having a great life. It showed these three guys struggling with what we today would call post-traumatic stress disorder, struggling with the big adjustment. Again, it's I know you're very young and it's very hard for you to kind of put yourself in these shoes, but if you're a man who's got off to war and you were working, as a soda jerk before the war, lucky enough to have a job, you're a young guy, you go off to war, you work your way up, you become a sergeant, a platoon leader, maybe even an officer, a pilot. You've got some respect, you've got some authority, you've got some command. You're used to taking orders and giving orders and having responsibility. And then all of a sudden you come back home and nobody cares what rank you were. You're starting out at the bottom, and they're very happy to welcome you back to your job as a soda jerk again. That was very hard for a lot of guys to deal with. It also took a while for the economy to transition out of wartime production into consumer production. So you had all of these factories that had been built to make warplanes, fighter planes, and tanks. Now nobody needed those anymore. So it took a while for those factories to turn around and start making cars and having people buy those cars. So not everybody came right back to a job. It was difficult for guys at first. But people did have some money in their pockets. I will talk a bit later about the GI Bill. The GI Bill was, again, one of the great... we should mention it now. Why not? I'll take a minute to talk about it. I don't have a graphic for you. The GI Bill was one of the great American success stories. GI, by the way, stands for government issue. And because GI, government issue, was stamped on all kinds of army equipment, soldiers came to get the nickname of GIs. The GI Bill that was put together at the end of World War II gave the men returning the right to a bunch of things. It was kind of like the country didn't want to make the same mistake they had made after World War I. So when the guys came home, they were entitled to medical care. They were entitled, which some took advantage of. Much more important to them was they were entitled to low-cost loans to buy houses. This created the suburbs. All those guys living in apartments in Brooklyn and Manhattan and the Bronx came home and found out that the government would be willing to let them get a mortgage at a pretty low interest rate. And they wanted to get out of the city. And so all of the suburbs on Long Island, Levittown being one of the most stunning examples, were thrown up almost overnight. All of a sudden, every city dweller wanted a 60-foot by 60-foot lot with a little 3-bedroom house on it to call his own. And because of the GI Bill, these guys had the possibility to get the loan to be able to do that. Now they were going to live out in the, quote, suburbs. That accomplished a whole ton of things. First of all, it meant that places like Long Island that had been largely farmland now suddenly became these little suburbs with, as they were called, the ticky-tacky houses on them. It meant that the guys who lived there worked, sometimes in factories, sometimes in offices, not in their hometown. They would have to commute into Queens or Brooklyn or Manhattan to go to work. What did that mean? Well, now they needed a car, and you needed roads to get to and from. So all of a sudden we were building roads like crazy, and we had a car culture arise, and a commuting culture. The commuter trains that went out to Long Island and up to Westchester and into Connecticut, these were for all of these GIs returning, getting new jobs, using their VA loans, VA mortgages, Veterans Administration mortgages, to get these houses. And it invented the suburb as we know it. Staten Island to some degree, not so much because it was hard to get over here. Staten Island really changed in the 1960s when they built the Verrazano Bridge, and then suddenly the commute was easy, and the population of Staten Island since 1964 has doubled and then doubled again. But in the late 40s and into the 50s, you had this rise of consumer culture. We should, we should take a moment to talk about that before I get to the Cold War. So let's do that, shall we? Let me just put down, as you're thinking about it, you have a rise of a consumer culture. People have money now. They've got jobs now. They want to buy. And you have advances in technology, by the way, I should point out. So, better refrigerators, better cars, better toasters, TV sets. So people are going out, spending their money, buying a lot of consumer items. Second, you have the GI Bill, which gives guys mortgages, which creates the suburbs. That also creates the car culture and the highway culture and the commuting culture. It does something else, though. The GI Bill gives these guys money to go to college. This was the first time in American history that there was a mass program to make it possible for guys to go to college. Before this, college was the province of two kinds of people. It was rich kids. And as I told you in class, it wasn't that college was all that expensive. Harvard was not ridiculously expensive in those days. But it meant that two things. First of all, you had to be able to spare the kid to go to school. Most, or a lot of families needed, their sons to go out and work in high school or right after high school to help support the family. Taking 4 years off to go, play around in Cambridge or New Haven to go get a degree, this was something the average person didn't have time for. And second, to get into those colleges, you had to really come from one of the feeder schools. And the feeder schools were all these little New England prep schools, Andover and Phillips Exeter and Groton, and so on, the Deerfield Academy, these real old-fashioned little prep schools, the prep schools like you see in a separate piece, and those were the feeders for those. So it was certainly possible for a kid from an urban high school, public high school, to go to Harvard or Yale. That was a possibility. It wasn't forbidden or anything. But it was kind of difficult and seen as not for me. The other kinds of people who went to college were really hard-driven, ambitious kids who went to places like City College of New York, CCNY, which is, I think I told you in class, was the poor man's Harvard. It was Jewish and Italian immigrant kids, some Irish immigrant kids, scrappy kids, often going to college at night or on weekends to to get their degrees and go become accountants. The GI Bill gave really blanket permission any guy who wanted to go to college to study anything, the government would pay for. Now remember, this is in a day when college tuitions were not $50,000 a year. They were a few $100s a year. But it made it possible for these guys to do it. And guys went off and studied. Some of them went to college and got a degree in business. A lot of them went to college and got degrees in English literature or art. They would go off and study in Paris. It was really a little bit of a free-for-all. And the professors loved these guys. I have talked to professors who taught them, and they ate it up because the guys in their classes were not spoiled 18-year-old punks who were more interested in the next fraternity party and going to the football game. These were older guys. They had already been in the military, so the youngest of them was already 22, 23. If they went in the military at 18, they were coming out, they were 21, 22, 23 already, so they were kind of mature. And they had been matured by the military experience in the war. They had grown up. They had been forced to act responsibly and act grown up. That's not to say, soldiers never cut up and have fun, but they were young men. They weren't little boys. And getting a group of guys like that into a philosophy class and getting them to tear into, questions of good and evil and right and wrong, it's a whole different experience. They take it seriously. They're grateful for the opportunity to explore great ideas. They actually do their homework. All of the things that college professors value in a kid. So the GI Bill was good for the guys who made use of it, and it was great for the colleges. It also enabled colleges to expand wildly. A lot of the schools that you're familiar with, including and particularly the Catholic schools, underwent enormous growth in the 50s and the late 40s because of all the GI Bill guys. They really saw it as an opportunity, and they did everything they could to throw open the doors and expand to absorb them. And it produced an awful lot of great writers, scholars, and artists. Also, as a side thing, they will never ever ask you this on AP, but I'm trying to help you understand. A lot of guys came back from the war, and there was a big there was an exploration of philosophy and religious thought. Let me say that. One of the great American Catholic writers was a guy named Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton was a Trappist monk who churned out a couple of dozen books. A great, important, wonderful writer of the 50s and 60s in the American Catholic Church. But one of his most famous books is The Seven-Story Mountain. And he kept a diary for his time in the monastery, and he eventually wound up publishing it. But he writes about being in the monastery, and he's there, at Mass and watching guys go up to communion, and these big 6'6" guys going up to communion who were there to become monks. A bunch of these really tall guys, because they were all paratroopers. To be in the paratroops in the Second World War, you had to be particularly tall. And he writes about these guys coming back from the war and exploring becoming monks, going into the monastery. You had a fair amount of that. You had a lot of guys who served in the military who came back from the war and went into Catholic priesthood, went into monasteries, went into religious ministry in Protestant denominations, or who took up the study of philosophy or of literature at the universities as a result of their experience. So anyway, it was an interesting time, a thing to realize about that. So 50s here, we have the consumer culture, we have the GI Bill, which really changed a lot of guys' lives, and don't underestimate how much that change in shifting people to the suburbs, out of the tenements of the city, out of those sort of city neighborhoods, out of those Brooklyn neighborhoods, and out into the suburbs where instead of having an apartment, you kind of expect to have your own little estate. It may only be 60 feet by 60 feet on a little one-house lot, but that becomes the norm for America. And no longer, I should point out, multi-generational households. Before the 1950s, it was very, very common. You had mom and dad, you had the kids, you had grandma or grandpa living with you, you had an aunt or uncle living with you, young marrieds. When the kids would get married at 18, 19, they often lived at home. Big old house with mom and dad, or lived in the apartment. Now the norm is, a young couple in their 20s with a couple of kids, three, four kids, living in a house on their own in the suburbs. And then what do you do with grandma and grandpa? So there's a lot of shift that takes place as a result of these subtle things. The car culture, as I said, creates then things, little things you don't think about. The supermarket. If you look in old Brooklyn neighborhoods, your parents, your grandparents, I'm not that old. I can remember at Staten Island. When I was a kid growing up, not that long ago, not a million years ago, we had television, we had electricity, we had fire. But, in a neighborhood on Staten Island, you had a butcher, you had a delicatessen, you had a pharmacy with a guy behind the counter who made up your medication for you. You had a little grocery store, and that was where, mom did her shopping on a daily basis. And then every couple of weeks, you might go out to one of the few, and they were there, but not that many of them, supermarkets to go do big shopping, as we sometimes called it, where you'd pick up, you'd really sort of resupply. Out in the suburbs, as they're being built, you don't have on the corner the grocery store, the soda fountain shop, the butcher, the the bakery. You don't have that. You have to get in a car and go drive to the big supermarket to do all that shopping. Eventually, it's going to lead to things like strip malls and then big malls. But those are all new things going on in the 50s, really. So these, I'm pointing out these subtle shifts. Seems like a small thing to give guys low-cost mortgages, but it winds up having these profound ripple effects on society, and that's really where history gets interesting. To see the ripple effects that these things can have, and how deeply they can change people's mentalities. Okay. Well, to get back to the Cold War stuff, I want you to kind of see this is the context in which people are living. But they're also living in a world with the atomic bomb. And you cannot overestimate what that did to people's thoughts. The idea that we now had a weapon that could destroy an entire city, that we were building an arsenal of such weapons that we could wipe out the world. There, in the 1950s, In 1952, the United States developed the hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb, without getting too complicated in the physics, remember I talked about a chain reaction, right? Okay, that's called fission. Fission is when you cut something apart. So the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, an atomic bomb, is a fission bomb. You were taking atoms and splitting them and releasing the energy that's inside them. A hydrogen bomb is a fusion bomb. Basically, you set off an atomic bomb next to a packet, if you want, of heavy hydrogen. That's hydrogen isotope with not just a proton in the nucleus, but a proton and a neutron in the nucleus. When you do that, when you set off an atomic bomb next to heavy hydrogen, you create fusion. That is, you take the two hydrogen nuclei, force them together to create a new helium atom, right? 2 protons, helium. And that sends off those 2 neutrons that's in the heavy hydrogen. They get knocked off and they go off to the next, go bopping off into space. And that can set up its own chain reaction, depending on the circumstances, but it certainly releases, when you hit those 2 neutrons off, it releases tremendous amounts of energy. So if you split atoms apart, you release energy, but if you force atoms together, you release tremendous amounts of energy. Much more energy. The hydrogen bomb is much, much, much more powerful than an atomic bomb. 1952, the United States sets off its first hydrogen bomb, and in 1953, almost immediately afterwards, the Russians set off one. My God, how did they get it that quickly? Well, that's the context of what's happening here. People are living in a world where we could be destroyed at any moment. And that's hanging over their heads. And when the Russians exploded their first atomic bomb in 1949, it scared everybody. Now the Russians could do it to us. So people are living in this world where everything seems rosy and terrific, and we're all living in a world made possible by the glories of chemistry and the new electrical appliances, and we all have money, and yet there's this cloud hanging over it all that we could all be destroyed in an instant. So the Cold War at home, in the midst of this. Okay. First of all, remember, this is all about the fight against communism. We know that we have at home in the 1940s and 50s Red Scares. Just as you had Red Scares before in American history, so in the 40s and 50s you get it in a big way. Why? Everybody knows Russia is out there and it's conquering things. We talked about the Berlin airlift. We talked about in 46, 47, all of those countries going communist. They're on the march. They're everywhere. They're coming, they're coming, they're coming. China goes communist in 49, and we have the Korean War in 50, and really 50 to 53. So that's on the horizon. And here at home, we had, to start with, this thing called the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. Hear me, be careful. The House Un-American Activities Committee is not McCarthy. Do not get them confused. They're different and separate things. The House Un-American Activities Committee actually goes back to the 30s, and you had a kind of, well, I want to say a little bit of a nut job, but an extreme and enthusiastic congressman named Martin Dies. Martin Dies was looking for traitors everywhere. Basically wanted to shut down anybody who didn't look like him, think like him. And so the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 30s, hunted down a lot of supposed infiltrators in United States society. Don't worry about him at this point. After the war, the House Un-American Activities is still around. And there's a young congressman named Richard Nixon who's on it. And Nixon was never chairman of the House Un-American Activities, but he becomes famous working for it. He's a young congressman from California. He had served in the military during the war. He had served in the Navy. Kind of the usual thing. He gets on this committee and begins to expose communist spies in the American government. The most famous of which is the Alger Hiss case. Alger Hiss was an official at the U.S. State Department, whom it turns out was in fact a communist sympathizer. Now there was huge controversy, and has been huge controversy for years, over Nixon's alleged persecution of Alger Hiss. He really destroyed Hiss's life. Whittaker Chambers was the guy who turned him in. Chambers claimed to have been a communist who turned, who kind of got religion and converted to being an ardent anti-communist, and came before this committee and outed Alger Hiss as a commie. Claimed that Hiss had used a hollowed-out pumpkin to hide microfilm in that had secret State Department documents so that Russian agents could come and pick it up. They were known, therefore, as the Pumpkin Papers. Nixon, if you were a conservative and a Republican, Nixon was a hero fighting commies and had outed this spy, Alger Hiss. A lot of people were skeptical of this, and for years it was thought that Hiss may have been innocent. Recent documents that have come to light from the Soviet archives show that no, actually Hiss really was a spy, and Nixon in this particular case got it right. But because that was exposed, people then began to get paranoid about communist infiltration everywhere. You had the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were husband and wife who were atomic scientists. They were physicists working with the American atomic bomb program. It was discovered that there was a circle of spies in Britain, in some of the very highest levels of British intelligence, working for the Russians. And a sort of outgrowth of this, or side piece of this, it was discovered that there were spies in the United States, specifically scientists who had been recruited by the Soviet Union to spy in the American atomic project. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were accused of having passed secrets to the Russians, which made it possible for them to get an atomic bomb. It's an interesting case, and you are free to please go look it up and read up on it if you are interested in it. Again, for years they were thought to be, a lot of people thought that they were innocent and had been railroaded, and it turns out that in fact they really did pass secrets over. There's still some lingering controversy about that. I invite you to go read up on it. But at the time, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were both convicted of atomic espionage, which was a special category of crime. Espionage is spying, but spying on the atomic program, there was a special law that made it punishable by death to be doing that. And Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were both executed as spies for having passed over that information to the Russians. So again, this sort of thing fed people's fear and paranoia about communists everywhere. that led to the Hollywood blacklisting. One of the things the House Un-American Activities Committee did was they decided that Hollywood, the movie business, which was so influential, I have to emphasize to you guys, before television comes along in the late 40s, movies were everything, and people routinely went out to the movies if they could afford it, obviously, several nights a week. The movies had much more impact then than they do now, and so the allegation was that the movie studios in Hollywood were really full of communist sympathizers and infiltrators, and that a lot of movies had been made which subtly or not so subtly espoused communism or the Russian cause. Writers, they claimed, slipped into seemingly innocent movies little bits and pieces of philosophy, little thoughts, little attitudes that were meant to influence people, particularly young people, that would start them thinking in a communist direction, and so on. The House Un-American Activities Committee called in dozens of writers, directors, producers, studio heads, and actors, and famously asking them, "Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?" And asking them to, quote, name names. That is, to give them lists of other people that they know. And there was a lot of coercion that went into this. If you went in front of the committee and you refused to testify, as several Hollywood people did, you could be destroying your career. The government was very powerful. The studio heads of MGM and Paramount did not want their studios labeled as being commie or pinko or communist sympathetic. So they would do anything to avoid that reputation, including fire writers, fire actors, and so on. There was the blacklist that came up. The blacklist was a list of those people whose names had surfaced in the communist investigation, and you were not to give them a job. It was basically destroying their career. They couldn't work any place in Hollywood because nobody wanted to be tagged as having hired a commie or an ex-commie. The truth about a lot of this was that you had a lot of people in the movie business who were left-leaning. They were enthusiastic supporters of the Roosevelt New Deal. Some of them believed in socialism, which is not the same as communism. Some of them had actually been members of the American Communist Party when they were very young and idealistic and in the depths of the Depression, and people saw it as a possible future. As far as I know, nobody has ever been proven as being on the payroll of the Soviet Union, and they believed that they were helping the world by destroying the United States. Were there people with liberal feelings and liberal tendencies writing in Hollywood? You bet. The writing profession tends to attract people of that attitude. But a lot of people's careers were destroyed in the Hollywood blacklisting simply because, and let me point out, none of this ever, there was no real open trial where they produced a witness who said this person is plotting against the United States or this person is engaging in spying. The accusation was simply that you were an actor or a writer who was sympathetic toward communist ideals, or had once subscribed to a communist newspaper, or had been to a couple of meetings of the Socialist Party, or something like this, and therefore, your depiction of Jane Eyre, could possibly be construed as being potentially influenced by communism. That was kind of how it was. But people were scared enough about the Soviet Union and the march of communism that that this sort of thing was taken very seriously. Okay. That gets us to Senator Joseph McCarthy. The Hiss case really made Richard Nixon famous as an anti-communist crusader. This is in the late 40s. And it was part of the picture of people becoming more and more concerned about communism, communist infiltration of government agencies, of entertainment, and so on. Along comes Joseph McCarthy. Joe McCarthy was senator from Wisconsin, who was looking for a way to make himself famous, and hit upon the idea of going after communists in government. So he gave a speech in February of 1950 in which he told an audience, this is a speech he gave in Wheeling, West Virginia, that all of America's foreign policy problems could be traced to communists who had infiltrated the State Department. And he stood up in front of this audience and said, I have in my hand, and he waved a piece of paper, a list of 205, a list of names known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party, who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department. So McCarthy is there, waving this around and claiming there's 205 communists. Well, this got picked up by everybody. Everybody, all the news agencies started to get very interested in this. And McCarthy started getting questioned left, right, and center. Well, who's on this list and how many are there? Well, every time McCarthy gave a speech after that, the number of communists in the State Department that he had a list of changed. 205, or there were 57, or there were this, or there were that, and you could never nail him down. To intelligent observers, it became clear that he didn't have any such list at all. He was just pulling a number out of his hat. But people were terrified. They were concerned. McCarthy then begins to hold hearings about communists in the State Department. And he's got a young assistant. His legal counsel is Robert Kennedy. People forget that Bobby Kennedy, and we're going to get to him in the 1960s, the brother of John F. Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy himself. John Kennedy, before he was president, when he was just a member of Congress, they both made their reputations as anti-communist crusaders. So, in any event, McCarthy starts to do his thing. Never really uncovers a single real communist. He makes unsubstantiated accusations against people, declares them to be disloyal, gives indirect hints, with winks and nods, who's really a communist, half-truths, bullies witnesses, won't allow them to answer. Bobby Kennedy eventually leaves and is replaced by another counsel to McCarthy, a guy named Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn, I think it would be hard to find anyone who has ever studied, written about, or knew Roy Cohn who found him anything other than a despicable human being. He was really a miserable guy. And not because of this. He just was a miserable human being as a human being. But he helped McCarthy with this sort of bullying campaign he had. You have to realize that simply calling somebody in front of a committee and asking them if they have ever been a member of the Communist Party, even if they say no, basically their life is destroyed. In America of the 1950s, if you had even gone that far in being accused of being a communist, you could not get a job. You certainly couldn't get a job for the government. No respectable person was going to have anything to do with you. It was a very quick and easy way to destroy somebody. And so anybody who tried to fight McCarthy, anybody who was going to criticize him, any journalist who was going to go after him, any person in government who would question him, all he had to do was hint that, this person is a communist as well. And that was it. People were terrified for that reason. Okay. That's 1950. He begins. There's a change of administration. Truman is out, and Eisenhower is in, 52. You have the election, and Eisenhower is a Republican, highly respected, and people largely vote for him because he is the great leader from the World War, and they're fed up with the Korean War. And they see Eisenhower as the guy who can kind of get us out of the Korean War. They've had enough. I should just mention here, the Korean War was not really a popular war in America. Nobody really knew much about Korea. We didn't feel an affinity for the Korean people. It seemed to be dragging on. It didn't have a lot of direction to it. And a lot of guys serving in Korea had served in World War II. One of the things was they got out of the war at the end of World War II. They went back to their homes, put their life together again, and just as they were putting their life together, they were called back out of service back into the military, particularly in certain specialties, like the pilots who served in Korea. A lot of the guys who served as pilots in Korea had been pilots in World War II, had gone home, had started their business again, had been back with their families for a couple of years, and then because the Army, the military, the Navy and so on needed pilots again, trained pilots, they drafted them back into the service. And, there were a lot of resentment about Korea. So Eisenhower, in part, was elected because of the Korean mess. Okay, what's that got to do with McCarthy? Both McCarthy and Eisenhower were Republicans. So people tried to get Eisenhower to denounce McCarthy for what he was doing, his baseless accusations and his bullying and his destroying of people's reputation for no reason. Eisenhower was reluctant to do that. He said it was because he didn't want to get down in the gutter with McCarthy. There may have been a level of fear he himself had of McCarthy, but it was under Eisenhower in 1954 that McCarthy destroyed himself. And he was destroyed by the medium of television. McCarthy decided to hold hearings on the Army in particular. The McCarthy Army hearings, I'm sure you can find them online, were all about the infiltration even into our sacred military of communists. And he wanted to accuse all sorts of quite honorable generals and heroes of having really been communists and infiltrating our military and weakening America. And so it was McCarthy up there, it was his counsel Roy Cohn, this creepy figure next to him, and he goes after the Army, and he's doing it while it's being carried on TV. And people can watch this happening. And if you couldn't tune in during the day, that was okay. Because one of the greatest journalists of all time, Edward R. Murrow, the guy who had reported on World War II, had reported on the London Blitz live on the radio as the Blitz was happening. He was a guy who defined radio journalism. When television came along, Edward R. Murrow was the guy who defined television journalism. And truly one of the greatest journalists we've ever had. He had a program in the evenings called, he had several programs in the evening. I believe this was the program called See It Now, where he took the films of that day's, of the hearings from that period, and ran them so people who didn't see them during the day could sit and watch them at night. And he just showed you McCarthy at his worst, yelling, bullying witnesses, not allowing them to answer, backing them into corners, asking them ridiculous questions. He really just let McCarthy be McCarthy, and people began to see what a jerk this guy really was. And it was in the middle of this that one of the most famous lines in American political history, Joseph Welch, W-E-L-C-H, and I urge you to look online, because there are, on Yahoo I'm sure you can find, or YouTube I'm sure you can find the films of this. Joe Welch was the lawyer, the counsel for the Army. So there's McCarthy holding these hearings, and Welch is there as the Army lawyer advising the Army guys there. And at a certain famous point in the hearing, he just stops and he looks across the table at McCarthy, and he says, out loud, what everybody's thinking. Senator, at long last, have you no decency? And he said it in the perfect way at just the perfect moment, and it showed up McCarthy for who he was, and it shut McCarthy up. I mean, McCarthy had no response to this. And that's really what undid McCarthy. Eventually, in 1954, the Senate finally censured McCarthy for dishonorable conduct that brought disrepute on the Senate. And, it's ended McCarthy's career. A couple of years later, he died. He was an alcoholic, and he had all kinds of problems. But McCarthyism, something you really need to know, is now a byword. To in modern English, to talk about McCarthyism means using half-truths, bullying tactics, and innuendos to destroy somebody because you don't like them or they don't agree with you on these sort of fictional witch hunts. And McCarthy was on a sort of fictional witch hunt to find communists where there were none. At least in Nixon's case, and Nixon was much criticized later for all of this, he actually did find some real communists in the State Department. McCarthy never did, and gave a bad name to the whole anti-communist cause. Okay, the last thing I want to cover in this post-war media post-war period is the Taft-Hartley Act. It's an important part of this, and it's something to know. First of all, I want to remind you of the Wagner Act. We remember the Wagner Act under Roosevelt, part of the New Deal. And we're going to just simplify it here to point out that it put restrictions on management and owners. That is, it restricted the owners of factories, managers of businesses, so that it empowered unions. They couldn't interfere with people who wanted to unionize. The Taft-Hartley Act which comes along, comes from Congress. And I should point out, it was done on an override of President Harry Truman's veto. Truman actually vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act, and Congress overrode him and passed it anyway. It put restrictions, on the other hand, on unions. Important to note. Now, let me just take a minute to give you background. The war ends, 1945. Everybody starts to come home. As I told you, during the war, people had a lot of money saved. You had all these women who had been working and had brought in money, good wages. You had all these guys in the military who had brought in good wages. There wasn't a lot to spend it on. Things were rationed. Things were in short supply. People were kind of cutting back. So you had all this money saved. The war ends. There's this burst of consumer spending. Everybody wants to go and spend. Problem was that there was so much demand, industry hadn't geared up to make consumer goods yet. They were just getting out of making tanks and planes. Well, all economics is supply and demand. When your supply is too high and your demand is low, the price goes down because you're trying to get people to buy it. When your supply is low and demand is high, on the other hand, price goes up because people, you can find somebody willing to pay more than the next guy to get it. So what happens in 46, 47, 48, 49 is prices jump. They take a great big jump, almost 50% jump of most items, which is huge inflation. Wham. Well, as the prices go up, people who are working want higher wages. If it costs me $1 for a loaf of bread today, and I'm making $1 an hour, and tomorrow it costs me $1.50, well, now I want $1.50 an hour. Management was not happy with that when workers started agitating for higher pay, and so you started having strikes. Right after the war, 46, 47, you had literally thousands of strikes across the country as workers struck to get higher and higher pay. Well, those strikes were viewed as unions abusing their power. We had given them some power under the Wagner Act, and so now they had gotten too big for themselves and they were abusing their power, and it was even a danger to the country and national security. So Congress writes this Taft-Hartley Bill, which it passes. Truman vetoes it, and Congress passes it over his veto. The Taft-Hartley Act did a couple of things. First of all, it barred, or I shouldn't say that, unions, put it this way, unions had to certify that leaders were not communists. So you basically had to take an oath that you were not now, nor had you ever been, a member of the Communist Party. It prohibited union contributions to political campaigns. So if you belong to a union, you couldn't go out and spend a lot of money to get your favorite congressman elected, because that was viewed as giving the unions too much power. Gave the government power to stop a strike for 80 days when it involved an issue of national security. So that meant that if a union wanted to strike, the federal government could go in and get a court order, an injunction, barring the union from going on strike for 80 days, if they could show that it would endanger national health and safety. So let's say the railroads wanted to go out. Well, the railroads are vital to the national economy, to the safety of everyone, to health. So the government would say, no, you can't strike for at least 80 days. The idea being that sometime in those 80 days, hopefully, you could get everybody to sit down and work out a compromise. Okay, but it also undermined the power of the union, because the clout a union has is in shutting down a business and costing management money until they agree to settle. And finally, and this really was one of the parts that got the most controversy, it empowered states to enact right-to-work laws. Now, a right-to-work law is a law that says that a person has to be permitted to work and take a job in a business even if they choose not to join the union. There are a lot of jobs, and there certainly were at this time, that you could not do if you were not a member of the union. If you wanted to go be a longshoreman unloading ships, you had to be a member of the ILA, the International Longshoremen's Association. If you were not a member of the union, you were not permitted to work on the docks. If you were going to work on the docks, you had to sign a union card and you paid dues to be part of it. A state that enacts a right-to-work law says you are allowed to join the union if you feel like it, but you don't have to. What that does from management standpoint is they would say it gives people freedom to make the choice for themselves. From the labor standpoint, what it does is they see it as management's way to divide up workers, to divide and conquer, to get workers working against each other, at odds with each other. Because if you're in a union, you have to pay dues for that. People are going to not want to be part of the union because they want to save a few bucks that way, and it's going to undermine, because what does a union have? The only thing it has to work with is solidarity. If everybody's a member of the union and everybody goes out on strike, you can force management to do what you want. If you don't have everybody on board, a strike isn't really going to work. So the Taft-Hartley Act was, it was, if you will, a conservative reaction to the New Deal, whereas Roosevelt was empowering unions and restricting managers against unions. Taft-Hartley was empowering management and restricting the power and the rights of unions. But also note this business of unions had to certify that leaders were not communists. There's an argument that in the United States you can hold any position you want. The Communist Party in the United States was not illegal. Throughout all this time you had a Communist Party. You could run for office on the communist ticket. We actually had communist officials in New York City. The city council for a time had a handful of members who were actually communists. We live in a land of political freedom. However, if you were a member of the Communist Party, well, you couldn't have a job with the military, you couldn't have a job with the federal government, and now you couldn't be a union leader because of your political opinions, because it was viewed that communism the flip side of this, communism was not merely a political opinion. It made you more loyal to the Soviet Union than to the United States. A lot of communists would have said that's not true. They were as much against Stalin as anybody else was, but this was the fear of the time. So part of the containment, remember that word, that was going on was also containment, if you will, domestically, at home. The containment against communist influence in unions, against perceived communist influence in Hollywood, and against the fear that communist spies were everywhere. Okay. I think we'll leave it there, and I'll pick up with other matters later. So we'll pick up with Eisenhower and all of that, and the civil rights movement with the next one.